In 1961, President Kennedy called on all Americans to rise to the challenges of the day. He knew that success depended upon the unity of efforts throughout the federal government and the nation. The Greater Boston Federal Executive Board, one of 28 across the country, fosters communication, coordination, and collaboration with federal, state, and local government agencies. This is your federal government, and I am your host, Diane LeBlanc. Hello, everyone. Today we are deviating just a bit from our usual format, and that we are not featuring one federal agency. Rather, our show will focus on a federal process, specifically the federal hiring process. The federal government is our nation's largest employer, and even in difficult economic times, needs to hire qualified individuals for a variety of different positions. Our guest today is Kimberly Ainsworth, who is the Executive Director of the Greater Boston Federal Executive Board and a subject matter expert on this topic. Kim, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So in the interest of full transparency, I want to let our viewers know that you and I have worked together for 15 plus years on the Greater Boston Federal Executive Board, and we are friends, and we've both been engaged in promoting careers in public service. So now that that is out there, you really have become the subject matter expert in this area. So when I started with the federal government 35 years ago, we had the old Civil Service Commission. Don't have that anymore. We have the Office of Personnel Management. Tell folks a little bit about that.
The Office of Personnel Management is the overarching human resources agency of the federal government, and its function is more policy making. The hiring process of the federal government was decentralized back in the 1990s, so federal agencies now have the ability to do the direct hiring themselves as opposed to going through a third party like the Civil Service Commission. So
in the opening, I said federal government, the nation's largest employer. What does that mean? How many people work for the federal government?
Collectively, we are the nation's largest employer. We have about 2.1 million full-time civilian employees. So if you added active duty military, postal service, part-time, temporary, and whatnot, we'd probably double those numbers. So we're absolutely the largest employer.
And where are the majority of these jobs located? I know some people think that the majority of jobs are in Washington, but that's actually not the case.
Correct. Less than 15% of the overall workforce actually lives and works in the Washington, D.C. metro area. So that means about 85% of us work out in field and regional locations in other parts of the country.
So what does that mean for Massachusetts and for New England in terms of the number of federal employees?
New England has about 6% of our workforce. In Massachusetts, we've got about 29,000 federal employees, and as do each of the New England states have several thousand. Boston is the regional city for New England, so just by virtue of that, Massachusetts has the largest number, but there are several thousand opportunities in each of the New England states.
Okay, several thousand opportunities. For what kinds of positions?
I like to say that the federal government hires everything from administrative assistants to astronauts and zoologists and everything in between. We have barbers and hairdressers and all kinds of occupations, so it does not, anything that you can imagine we hire.
Okay, so you don't necessarily then need a background in political science or public administration?
You do not. In fact, we hire nurses, doctors, people with medical backgrounds, financial backgrounds, budgeting, anything in between.
Okay. Do you need to take a test to get a federal job?
Not anymore. You used to back 20 or 30 years ago. In order to, you just have to go into the Civil Service Commission and take a civil service exam, and those exams don't exist anymore. For the most part, you just have to apply through the normal process or submitted resume. There are some occupations that require an exam, particularly things like criminal investigators through law enforcement, but there is no overarching civil service exam.
What about the Postal Service? Federal?
They are. They're a federal entity. So that we call them a federal entity because they don't receive appropriated funds. They do generate their own income, but they are part of the federal government retirement system.
Okay. I know, so you've already dispelled a few myths. There's not sort of an overarching exam that everybody takes to get on some sort of a civil service list. The majority of jobs are, in fact, across the country where the American citizenry lives. They're not located in Washington. I know another thing that we've come up against as we've gone out and promoted careers in public service. Folks think that you need to know somebody on the inside to get a federal job. Dispel that myth.
Yeah, and I would say that is a myth, but it does still exist out there. In fact, a very small majority of people do get their jobs because of who they know, because there's laws. We have what we call merit principles, which prevent influence in regards to hiring decisions. People do network like any other industry out there to get to know about positions and informational interviews and things like that. But in terms of influencing for government jobs, there are laws that prevent that.
And there is a process that you need to go through. So let's talk about the process. How does somebody get started if they think they're interested in working for the federal government?
Well, like many agencies out there, the federal government has moved almost exclusively to an online platform. And there's a website that's been developed called USAjobsgov. So anybody who wants to work for the federal government, that should be their first stop, www.usajobs.gov.
Okay, so you go there, and then what?
Well, if you have not been on it before, I like to tell people to become familiar with it. It is I have to remind people that it is a .gov site, and it is free. There are some different websites, commercial websites out there that have come about, but USAjobs.gov is our single point of entry for government jobs. And take some time, play around with it, look at particular occupations that you'd like to look at, or look at particular locations. And you might see an occupation or a location that you never even knew existed before.
So every federal agency is required to post their jobs on this one site?
Correct. It is the single port of entry for executive branch, so it doesn't include things like judicial, the courts, or legislative branch if you worked for a member of Congress, but every executive branch agency does use that site.
Okay, so you go out there, you become familiar with the site, and you find a position that interests you, perhaps with Citizenship and Immigration Services, and it's in Boston, or it's in another part of the country that you're willing to move to, and there's an opening. What then? Everything is online? Is it a resume process?
Well, first of all, it's really important to read the entire vacancy announcement completely and to understand what the application process entails. As said before, some occupations do require that you be invited to take an exam, but for the most part, it is just applying, following the directions, or submitting a resume online via the portal.
Okay. So what if you don't see anything on the particular day that you go out there that's of interest to you? Is there an opportunity to create a profile so that you receive notifications if an agency is hiring for a position that would be a good match for you?
Great question, and the answer is yes. USA Jobs is updated at least daily, usually a couple of times daily. So I like to say if you don't see something today, it doesn't mean that tomorrow or next week something might not pop up. And there are ways to do searches and be notified when a particular agency that you want to work for, or a particular location, or a particular occupation. They'll notify, the tool will notify you when something pops up, given the keywords that you have added in.
Okay, so how long does the process take from start to finish? I apply for a federal job today. When am I likely going to be working for the federal government?
It's hard to say because there's so many different factors in play. I would say we're getting better, but the minimum is probably 60 days. Depending on the nature of the job, for example, if a security clearance were necessary or some type of other process beyond the actual interview process, it might take longer, but our target is about 60 days.
So going back to the process, filing that application online, do you get a notification back saying your application has been successfully transmitted? Is there an ongoing communication throughout the process so you don't sort of feel like it's gone into a big black hole?
There is. We are required to regularly communicate with all applicants, and that should happen at 3 different stages of the process. Upon the application, upon the interview process, and then upon the selection of the candidate.
Okay. So if folks aren't hearing, if they're not getting these notifications, what do they do?
every announcement that's out there has a point of contact listed on it, and I always suggest to be as in communication with that person or that point of contact as often as you'd like to try to find out what the timelines are.
Okay. So not everybody is computer savvy, not everybody has the ability to file an application online. If you don't have that ability, does that mean you are precluded from applying for a federal position?
In most cases, you are required to file via the online process, but there also is a process to file for what's called a hardship. So if you are not able to file via the internet, you can contact the folks at the hiring agency and ask for either US mail or a fax or some other way to submit your application.
Okay. So all great information. I want to talk about some of the special hiring authorities that are out there that govern how the federal hiring process is managed. Students, for example. I know that, you know, when I was sort of coming up in the system, I was part of a particular student program. I think you might have come on through the Presidential Management Intern Program. Mm-hmm. How does a student come to work for the federal government or a recent graduate?
The federal government has a lot of great and robust student programs and does a lot of hiring annually. Sometimes it's via relationships that a particular school has with an agency because it's mission focused and it matches the major, things like that. But there are also some hiring programs out there under what we call pathways. And they are also positions that are advertised on USA Jobs. There's always public notice to these jobs. And somebody can apply for either a summer internship or some other time of the year through the USAjobsgov website as well.
Is there a particular website set up just for students, or is it, again, everything on USA Jobs?
Well, there is a companion site called studentjobs.gov that is affiliated with USAjobs.gov, and it explains in more depth every student program that's out there. But it is, again, it's a companion site, so both of them work in concert with one another.
Okay. Another hiring authority that's out there is what we call the Schedule C appointments. Mm-hmm. We mentioned earlier that the majority of jobs you need to go through the process, but what is Schedule C?
Schedule C is a hiring authority that's given to any president. Any president of the United States has the discretion to appoint folks to represent him in field or regional location. So it is a political appointment that the president gets to make.
Okay. So what does that mean for Massachusetts and New England? I know that through the Federal Executive Board, we represent over 190 different federal agencies in our area. And the majority of those individuals, those agency heads, they are not political appointees, but some are. Talk about them.
Yes, we have, in the New England region, we have about 25 political appointments. And those are, again, folks that the president has appointed to represent his ideology in the field. And they represent a number of different agencies, from GSA to FEMA to HUD and some of the other agencies. Some are regulatory and some aren't.
So when the administration changes, that person...
Those positions also change,
okay,
yes.
So there would be somebody new put in that position. How about special hiring authority for hiring the disabled?
There is also a hiring authority out there for Schedule A, and it enables federal agencies to hire qualified individuals with disabilities for jobs directly without competing a job. So it makes it much easier on us as hiring managers and also as candidates seeking jobs.
Okay, and if you wanted to find more information about that, you would look?
There's a variety of different resources out there, most online, but again, USA Jobs could be your single point of contact to learn about any of the hiring authorities.
Okay. Veterans preference.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that most people have heard. Mm-hmm. In this country, the federal government, we give preference to those that have served our country. What exactly is veterans preference?
Again, well, you explained it. Any man or woman who has served our country and is a veteran gets additional preference in relative to federal government positions. And there's a 5-point preference and there's a 10-point preference for a disabled veteran. And it all depends on your service activities and level of disability. But it's either 5 or 10 points.
So how do you know if you qualify for veterans preference?
Well, most folks who are seeking jobs would start to understand that they, as a veteran, that they are eligible for some type of preference. But again, there's lots of resources out there that can help you understand what level of preference you are. You can either use some of the online resources that are out there, or you can work through the VA or the Veteran Service Representative in your community to figure out what your preference might be.
Now, what about the spouse or the children of veterans? Are they entitled to any sort of special preference?
There is something called a derived preference, and what that means is if the veteran is not able to claim the preference themselves, then it can go to either a spouse or a child. It would be if the person has passed away as a result of their disability from service, or if the person is not able to work due to a disability, then their spouse or children can take derived preference.
So you mentioned with the hiring authority for disabled individuals that there doesn't necessarily have to be the competition factor for certain positions. What about for veterans? Do veterans need to compete with others for their positions?
Well, a number of veterans would fit into the Schedule A hiring authority as disabled veterans, so by virtue of that, they would be able to apply under that hiring authority. But for the most part, veterans do have to compete against qualified candidates, the jobs that are open to the public. However, their preference can give them a leg up, so to speak, on other candidates of equal qualification of them.
But the bottom line is anybody that gets a federal job needs to be qualified to perform that job at a full performance level.
Correct, and that's the key component there. The person does have to be qualified. You are not appointed to a job by virtue of the fact of having a disability. You have to be qualified and able to perform the job, for example.
Okay, we have many men and women who've returned from serving our country recently, and the federal government is actively seeking veterans to apply for positions that are vacant. What do those trends look like? How many veterans have been hired?
Right now, about 25% of our workforce worldwide claims veteran status, and that about 25% of all new hires over the past 2 years have been veterans.
So, and that's interesting. You say worldwide. You know, we've been talking about Massachusetts and New England and even sort of the numbers from across the country, but the federal government really does hire people who work in all parts of the world, depending upon the agency. So let's see. We've talked about some of the other hiring authorities. Is the federal government currently hiring?
The federal government is hiring. Like many industries, we have our peaks and valleys, but so it would depend on when actual hiring is done. Sometimes it's just mission critical, sometimes it's more widespread than that, but for the most part, hiring is ongoing based on a number of different factors, including retirements.
So what advice do you have for somebody who's interested in a federal job?
My advice is a couple of things. Again, your first option would be USAjobsgov. Take a look at it, play around with it, start to learn more about what the federal government has to offer. And second would be due diligence. Read the vacancy announcement fully, make sure you follow the directions, get all your paperwork in order. I do know that some of the biggest mistakes are when an application asks for something like a transcript, or it asks for a copy of your DD-214 if you're a veteran, and folks don't include that in their application practice. It becomes problematic on our end processing, so that can disqualify you from a job if you don't have the complete package submitted. What
about mobility? If you are willing to move for an agency, does that increase your chances of getting a federal job?
I like to tell people that I think it's a personal choice. A lot of people love to relocate, and the vacancy announcements will be basically very clear as to whether it requires you to be mobile or not. In most cases, it's not mandatory, but sometimes people choose to for their own career paths, but it will be clearly stated if it is to be mobile. And you know, it's a numbers game, and if there's a small amount of jobs, 6% of the workforce is here. If you're more mobile, then you just spread yourself, make yourself more widely available.
So again, over the years, you and I have done outreach to high schools and colleges, and I know you are still very much actively engaged in that process. And I've heard you give some great advice to young people who think that they might want a career with the federal government. And I remember when we used to go out together, you know, every kid we saw wanted to work for the FBI or the CIA or the very glamorous agencies, but you give them some really good advice with regard to social media.
I do. I mean, I think social media is great tools, and I think they really help us reach the population, but I also try to urge people to be careful because it can really be harmful to career based on a number of different factors. For example, if your position requires a level of security clearance, social media can really be something that can be harmful to you.
The other thing I know that, we always tell people, again, sometimes the questions, they can be tricky. Read the questions carefully, and you have to be honest. Don't embellish, don't stretch the truth. Sometimes if you've had a past experience, if you report it and you disclose it, that's okay. People who try to cover something up, that's generally worse than the initial act that they're concerned about disclosing.
For the most part, yes. I mean, we always do encourage people to be forthcoming because it's better to find out at the very beginning than to go through the whole process and then find out at the end. Like you said, it's easier to deal with at the forefront than at the back end.
Okay. How did you come to work for the federal government?
Well, as you referenced earlier, I came in through a student program called the Presidential Management Internship Program, which is now the Presidential Management Fellows Program, and it's a management training program for graduate students, and that's how I started over 15 years ago.
Okay, and from there, who did you work for?
I started working for the EPA in Boston and had some great opportunities working for them, and then I transferred over to, my position is now funded by Homeland Security.
Okay, and as executive director of the Federal Executive Board, that is actually the entity that sponsors this show. You run the day-to-day operation. Tell folks, what does that mean?
The Federal Executive Board, we are an entity that supports all of the federal agencies in the greater Boston area. As you referenced earlier, there's about 190 federal agencies, and there's small agencies, large agencies, military, civilian, postal, law enforcement. So it's our job to help agencies collaborate around significant issues in the federal government in the field.
If you had it to do over again, would you come to work for the federal government?
Absolutely, no question.
All right. What are some of the benefits of working for the federal government?
Well, I mean, I always encourage people to look at the total package of any employment, and salary is part of that. And I believe that the federal government is a competitive employer in terms of salary, but we also have pretty competitive packages in terms of leave, sick time, and vacation time. And there's other flexibilities we have out there, like student loan repayment is one that's available. There's things like leadership development. There's opportunity to work in different parts of the country or the world. So there's our benefits packages in terms of retirement. They're all, as I said, very competitive.
So you mentioned retirement. Retirement directly relates to whether or not there are vacancies, openings for new folks who want to get into the federal government. What are the retirement trends?
We are finding that people are retiring. This day and age, there are about 40% of our workforce is eligible to retire. So I like to tell people 2 million federal employees, 40% on any given day are eligible to retire. And we are seeing people retiring as they're in droves nationwide.
So we've covered an awful lot of ground. What have we not told folks that they should know about the federal hiring process?
We did not talk about the feds hire vets. I think that we talked a little bit about our veterans preference and our priority to hire veterans, but USAjobsgov is a great site, but also we have a companion site called fedshirevets.gov, which will help you understand more of your preference. And again, I just suggest that you follow the process thoroughly and be careful and be patient, and it will work out.
Excellent. That's it. Thank you so much. Again, I want to thank him, Ainsworth, for being with us today and for helping us to better understand the federal hiring process. I thank you for watching and hope that you will continue to join us as we feature federal agencies on your federal government.
My name is Ross Shoemaker, former Marine, 2 tours in Iraq. Now I work for the U.S. Forest Service on the Columbine Ranger District on engine 682. Grew up on a small farm in western Illinois, just outside of Cambridge, Illinois, with brother, sister, and parents. After I left the farm, I went to college for a year and played college football, and then after that I joined the Marine Corps. I wanted to be a Marine. It's something I've always wanted to do since I was little. I had my older brother was in the Marine Corps. I had other families, grandparents and stuff, and always heard growing up Marines are the best, and I wanted to be the best, so joined the Marine Corps. Well, after the Marine Corps, I was having a little trouble finding jobs. I moved out to Colorado. I was looking for another way, to maybe jump back in the government or something like that, and found the job in the U.S. Forest Service, and I love it. So on a day-to-day basis, show up to work about 8 o'clock, then we start physical training right away, or PT. Typically we run between 3 to 10 miles, depending on who's running the PT or what else we got going on that day. PT can be very challenging, but it's very necessary for our job, and it helps get the day going. Today after PT, we went up to La Plata Canyon, and we went up there, we marked a bunch of hazard trees in the campground, which are trees that are basically dead or dying. They have the potential to fall on campers, so we go and take the hazards away. It's a very dangerous job. Well, you have to be very situationally aware of when you're cutting trees, your entire area, who's around you, whether you have hikers, bikers, campers around you, because safety is the most important thing. The reason I really love this job is this is my office. I don't think I'd be able to sitting behind a desk all day, and I work with really great people all day, and I'm in some of the most beautiful spots in the world. Another reason I like this job is serving my community. Yeah, sometimes you just have to stop and take a look around and realize where you're at. I mean, it's amazing. After the workday's done, I like to kick back and play some kickball, play some softball. I'm in a couple leagues with some firefighter buddies and stuff like that. A beard has never helped me in a fire situation. It has helped me with the ladies a few times, though. Only in Durango. My name is Ross Shoemaker, proud to be a Marine Corps vet and proud to still be serving my community as a wildland firefighter.